It's a pleasure to welcome everybody back. Thank you very much. Thank you for having been here through the day and for being here again. And I'd like to thank President Bok for joining us this afternoon. It's such a pleasure to have you here. I was just saying to President Faust beforehand that one thing has come home very powerfully to me as I was preparing for today's events and looking back in the archives and read your 1976 essay in Change about moral education. What has pressed itself upon me, and I said a bit about this morning, was that when you wrote that essay, it was in the wake of both Vietnam and Watergate and Nixon. And of course, there were the huge problems of public trust and trust in institutions and so forth. And here, in fact, we find ourselves again in a very similar moment. And so to have your voice as a leader of a university articulating a vision in that moment, I think is a helpful thing for all of us as we try to think about that question in the present. And so that, of course, will be the topic of our panel this afternoon. But before we get to our panel, I'd like to welcome our current president of Harvard, President Drew Faust, distinguished historian, a woman with a powerful vision for the university, One Harvard. We, I think, at the Ethics Center exemplify the goal of bringing together the skills and intellectual resources across the university on important problems together in a collaborative endeavor. And President Faust has set high standards for all of us, and it is a delight and honor to have her here with us this afternoon. She's going to make a few brief remarks before we get to our panel. So, President Faust.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you all so much for being here and for inviting me to be part of this. It's quite an illustrious group that has gathered to celebrate this marvelous institution and its anniversary. And I especially want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be in the same room with two Harvard presidents, Derek Bok and Neil Rudenstein, and with Angelica and Sisela. We haven't all been in the same place for a while, and so Mrs. Safra, thank you for bringing us together. It's also wonderful for me to be here with Danielle, who is proving to be such a marvelous leader for this organization and building on her predecessors. Where's Larry? There's Larry Lessig, Dennis Thompson. And I think that the kind of leadership that this organization attracts is a tribute to its mission and to the importance of what it represents for all of us at Harvard. I want to give special thanks, though, to Lily Safra, the chairwoman of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation, the principal benefactor of this Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, and also the Edmund J. Safra Honorary Fellow in Ethics. Her generosity, her prescience, her moral vision have enabled the scale and significance of the achievements that we're celebrating today. We are far better equipped to face the challenges that Danielle alluded to that face us with such force at the moment because of Mrs. Safra's dedication to her late husband's legacy and her sustained commitment to this Center for Ethics at Harvard that proudly bears his name. Edmund J. Safra was a genuine philanthropist. His deep belief in cultivating trust in organizations, upholding the dignity of individuals, and honoring the value of human life infuses the ongoing work that Mrs. Safra pursues through the Edmund J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation. The foundation supports causes and organizations all over the world with a mission to spread hope, love, opportunity, faith, and inspiration. We see this mission fulfilled in its work to advance medical and scientific breakthroughs, to provide relief from suffering and disease, to create and strengthen innovative programming in the arts, music, and education. On our own campus, we see the Foundation's mission expressed in many fellowships, workshops, public events, seminars, books, lectures, and informal conversations that spring from the center year after year. I'm told it was the promise of our Harvard students that first moved Mrs. Safra to offer her direct support to the center, what they could mean for and in the world. By endowing the graduate fellowship program, she ensured that our graduate students would have the intellectual space and the interdisciplinary environment that would enable them to thrive and to grapple with enduring ethical problems that shape their research. For almost 20 years, Lily has supported the center's undergraduate and faculty fellowships and Lawrence Lessig's research lab and its vision of rooting out corruption and promoting institutional ethics, all in line with her late husband's lifelong commitments. This long history of financial support for the center has been matched by Mrs. Safra's steady personal engagement in its work. Almost every year, she comes and sits beside the students in an undergraduate or graduate seminar. This year, she came to the table for a discussion on the ethics of identifying terrorists by name in news and media reporting. She read the assignments, she listened to the deliberations, and she challenged her fellow learners with questions and ideas. She also took the opportunity to deliver a message on the importance of the practice of love, which she has exemplified through her philanthropy. Mrs. Safra has dedicated herself to creating the necessary conditions for sharp ethical inquiry, and today is no different. On this occasion of the center's 30th anniversary, it's my great privilege to announce that Mrs. Safra has once again renewed her call to continue improving ethics teaching and learning at Harvard and beyond. The Edmund J. Safra Philanthropic Foundation has committed a generous gift to the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics to support a campus-wide ethics pedagogy initiative. This 3-year initiative will enable the center to play a leading role in course innovation and course support for ethics instruction. This will include new contributions to the general education curriculum in ethics and civics, as well as new ethics pedagogy fellowships for graduate students. It's a remarkable gift that exemplifies Mrs. Safra's special admiration for students and her trust in education's capacity to move society forward. On behalf of Harvard University, the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, its directors, its faculty committee, its staff, and its exceptional fellows, many of whom are with us today, please join me in thanking Mrs. Safra. God bless you. And this is just,
it's very hard to know what to give to the woman who has everything and is just so generous herself. But so it's a picture book of all the classes of fellows over the years and letters from people you've come to know over the year expressing our gratitude to you. So thank you very much.
President Faust, Professor Allen, Professor Lessig, Professor Thompson, dear friends. I am thrilled to be back at Harvard with all of you, and I want to offer my heartfelt congratulations on the Edmund J. Safra Center's 30 years of achievements. You have been so gracious in expressing your thanks for my support. And I wish to say again, as I always do, that I am far more grateful to you in return. The faculty, fellows, and students of this center are some of the most brilliant people in the world who could achieve greatness in whatever field they choose. So I feel very fortunate that these talented scholars have decided to devote themselves to ethics, particularly seeing the terrible problems our societies are facing today. To all of you, thank you. We are all counting on you. I know my husband Edmund would join me in gratitude, and he would encourage you to work even harder and do even more. I am certain that you will meet this challenge, and it will be a privilege for me to continue to be by your side. I wish you all many more years of success. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the generous words. So now I'd like to introduce my colleagues, invite them to come for the hard work that you've just called us to, the question of the engaged university and how we ought to think about the university's public-facing role in contemporary circumstances. It's my pleasure to invite President Faust back to the panel, Dennis Thompson, founding director, and Elizabeth Kish, a former fellow and president of Agnes Scott, who also founded the Ethics Center at Duke University. So Dennis is going to launch us with a few remarks, and then we'll engage in conversation before turning it over to Q&A and responses from the audience.
Yeah, since I'm the only non-president here, I thought I better seize the opportunity that Danielle gave me, and she gave me 10 minutes. And I wanted to put something on the table which I believe and hope my colleagues will disagree with, a little bit at least. The engaged university, that's the topic. Usually the standard view, and I generally agree with it, is that universities ought to take positions and provide institutional support in public only for issues that directly affect the educational mission. Now, there are plenty of them right now, but immigration affects our students, research funding, financial aid policies, and the like. And there are also many ways that universities contribute to, and our members, to society through teaching and research and outreach and endowment management. All that's important. But I want to suggest today something a little different. I'm going to suggest that universities should engage more assertively, even aggressively, in the public sphere than they've been inclined to do in the past, not just Harvard, but other, and on a subject or a topic, an issue that they have not usually raised in that way in the public. I want to suggest universities have an obligation to engage with the general threat to veracity in public life. Call it epistemic ethics, if you like. By veracity, I mean something very simple, simply the propensity to speak and act in accord with widely recognized facts and to respond to reasonable demands for evidence. And that's maybe even more important than the facts. Not necessarily truth with a capital T. I'm staying away from that. Now, in the past, it might have been sufficient enough, I think, for universities to respect veracity in their own activities and encourage the practice by their own faculty and students. And then we could take it for granted that there's a body of scientific knowledge, humanistic knowledge, economic data, common sense observations that are not really, no one but crazy conspiracy theorists or ignorant citizens would challenge. But now now we find ourselves in a brave new world. This factual common ground has been eroding for a long time in public debate, and recent events have fractured it, maybe destroyed it for the time being. And I call on the authority of that estimable conservative philosopher, Stephen Colbert, the original one, who coined the term truthiness, which is now in the OED, I think. And that was back in 2005. Now, it's not the opposite of truth. It's a complete disdain for facts and evidence. And I'll just show you a 60-second clip to remind you, if we can. That's enough about Iraq. So I don't have to remind you of all the tweets that have come from Trump there, but I did notice that a Canadian researcher recently counted 560 of them and published an article showing how many there were. But the problem goes well beyond Trump, and this truthiness showed itself in the Brexit campaign in the UK, climate change denial here in a lot of countries, the exaggeration of risks about vaccines, the spread of harmful rumors from what used to be kept on the edges of the media now through social media and the mainstream media are in all of our consciousnesses. So facts, of course, are, I don't want to do an epistemology lecture. They are contestable, subject to interpretation. Which facts are relevant is also important, and so facts alone won't solve the problem, won't put an end to disagreements. But they could, and the demand for evidence could at least help us focus better on what the real disagreements are. And that's what we've lost. This is not a partisan issue. Veracity is not a partisan cause. It need not politicize universities. Yes, right now, truthiness and alternative facts seem to come more from the right, not exclusively. So, but it seems respectable Republicans, and there are quite a few even here, and honest conservatives, there may be some of those too, they believe in veracity just as much as I do. So universities especially believe in it, and they have a special obligation, an ethical obligation, I think, and a special competence to promote veracity, and under present circumstances, to do so beyond their own walls. That's not just guardians of veracity, but advocates for it. And how? How can they do this? I'm not proposing that we set ourselves up as some giant fact-checking factory or something like that. But we are well positioned, I think, to repurpose some of our usual familiar academic instruments to promote veracity in the public sphere. And I want to suggest, not just as individuals, of course we ought to do it, not just the Ethics Center or the Environmental Center, but as institutions, we need to collaborate with one another. And by collaboration, I mean not just Harvard and Princeton, but Harvard and Agnes Scott, Princeton and Berea College. And to do this in a more visible, active way. For example, let me give you 3 examples, and then I'll pretty much stop. We could collaborate and defend publicly well-established bodies of knowledge that are under truthiness attack in the public sphere. Climate change, crime rates, gun violence, vaccine safety. Individual faculty and some professional associations are already doing it, but universities could actually encourage in a more collaborative way challenges to facts, not necessarily policy positions, but facts and evidence. Second, we could strengthen and help reinforce what I call institutions of fact. The repositories of data and information, like the Congressional Budget Office, the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which are under attack now, actually, in ways they never were before. And if you don't believe that, look at some of their counterparts in the states. So facts and evidence need a little help from what I would call us the guardian of veracity. And finally, we should encourage and promulgate more research of the sort that's already being done on the mechanisms of truthiness, you might call it, how people come to believe these obviously false beliefs, and how could they protect themselves against politicians and others who would mislead them, and what's the role of the social media in that. Research is going on in that way, but it's in scattered places in different universities, and it's not as prominent as it should be. So given the fragmentation of the media and the increasing tendency of students to stay in their own communicative bubbles, how could we have any hope of actually reaching people who most need the message? I think that is a difficult problem, maybe intractable actually in the short run. In the world of truthiness, universities don't have much credibility, so our influence is going to have to be indirect. But we still have some secret weapons or some resources that are not, and our best secret weapon are students. For example, we could support and encourage our students to go back to their high schools and local communities in various ways into the heartland to promote accuracy and public discussion on particular issues or maybe in general. And administrators, presidents could bring students to alumni events to talk about projects, veracity projects. You may not want to call them that, but in this general area. In other words, put the institutional stamp on behind these. We have a comparative advantage if we look far enough in the future. We have influence over the education of leaders. That could start early. We could do what Danielle, Miera, Levinson, others are working on civic education. I would like to see the civic education we provide to high schools and elementary schools with more emphasis on how you recognize when somebody's not telling you, is not being veracious, is there such a word? How to ask for evidence. So, in conclusion, the obligation, it is an ethical obligation of veracity, is something that ethics centers, too, have a role to play. And I think we can take some pride in our commitment in the Safra, Edmund J. Safra Center to fact-based and evidence and reason-driven ethical teaching and research that we've been doing for 30 years. I can't say we've actually made the world better, but it could have, it was suggested this morning, it could have been worse. And we can find some hope. I think this is where I can be more confident, that the leaders and fellows will continue to do that kind of work in the future. I would just hope universities may come to join them as well.
Thank you, Dennis. So, Drew, Harvard's motto, of course, is Veritas. It has a certain connection to veracity. And I know in opening exercises you talked about that theme and that you've been thinking since the election about this question of how Harvard can defend truth, veracity in a broader public context. Have you found ways forward for doing that?
Let me just begin by saying that this clip from Colbert, I think, reminds us of a kind of prescience. This was 2005?
Exactly.
I think that's very striking, that these issues have long preceded our recent concerns, most immediate concerns. And they're ones that I think derive from a real problem that was most clearly articulated by the Harvard Council of Deans on the Thursday morning after the election. I asked the deans of all the schools who've become a wonderful kind of leadership team for the university to come together and talk about what was going on in their schools, how were people responding to the election, what were people feeling. And what we came to recognize was we are in a bubble. And how have we managed to not understand that better, and how do we get out of our bubble? And it seems to me that much of what Dennis has said is about that. How do we transmit our concerns, our standards of evidence, our commitment to truth beyond those of us who might be part of an ethics center or part of a small unit that is called Harvard University in a larger society? And so, Dennis, much of what you've described, some of it seems doable, some of it seems practical, some of it seems impractical. But I'd like to just reframe it as, what are the mechanisms that can enable us to get beyond an echo chamber of shared commitment to a set of standards for evaluating evidence and establishing veracity, and have others join with us in believing in that? And I think what troubles me the most about your suggestions is that I'm not sure anyone wants to listen to the institutional voice, or that there are many people who don't want to listen to the institutional voice of Harvard saying there is climate change, vaccines are safe, and that the resentment of expertise and elitism, which is at the heart of the movement that Colbert so presciently described, would make that ineffective. So what are the ways? And some of the things you mentioned, I think, are key. Jeremy Knowles used to, at that same event when he was dean many years ago, and he died almost a decade ago now, but he would say to the incoming students, the most important thing about education was captured in something I believe it was an Oxford professor said to him, which is, it's to learn how to understand when someone's talking rot. And that's a good beginning. If we had that meter operating in our society, we would not be in all the trouble we're in. So how do we create a society in which people have the capacity to understand when someone is talking rot? It seems to me the School of Education is critical here. What are we teaching young children in school? How do they develop these faculties? How do they become civically educated, moral people who have a rot meter? What are we doing with our own students, and how do we enable them to do this? In our professional schools, in our college, everywhere, how is this one angle at getting at what you were talking about? And then how do we get beyond the immediate range? Well, obviously, if we changed all of public education, that would be beyond our immediate range. But we just need to think, I think, more systematically about persuasion, not just dissemination, because I'm not sure there's an eager audience waiting to hear our judgments about climate change or vaccines. What is going to make someone want to listen to that and have the capacity to use the evidence that our variety of scholars produce to judge a world in which they live? That was too much, sorry.
No, that was great. I'm going to come back to several points, but I want to invite Elizabeth to jump in and share where you disagree with Dennis.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, I agree with Drew about the larger, the larger issue, it seems to me, is this kind of distrust of elites, which is, a theme certainly in American politics. It's something that has been a recurrent theme in American politics. But how it has infected people's understanding of things like science. On the climate change debate, if you've noticed over the past few years, and frankly, it is very intentionally, it has been developed by right-wing think tanks as a way in which they train, like members of Congress, that they will preface their remarks with, well, I'm not a scientist, but. So there's actually been a pretty, I would say, intentional and systematic effort to undermine things like the scientific method. And so, there may be actually good reasons for people today to distrust elites, There are no good reasons to distrust the scientific method and the rules of evidence. And so how do we, as educators, as colleges and universities, try to flip that. And I agree with you. The question is, how can we be persuasive there? I mean, I was talking to my husband earlier about, here I am, Agnes Scott, Harvard, there's a little bit different. Harvard can make a statement, and it does make the New York Times. I would probably have to immolate myself in front of the New York Times, which I have no intention of doing, but to get their attention. But I do think that collectively higher education, if we could figure out a way where we decouple this, I love the rot meter. I mean, in a way, the distrust of elites itself is a kind of rot meter. People think elites are rotten. So how do we change the conversation where, how do we take philosophy to the streets, essentially, and empower people to understand what the scientific method is, how it actually is an empowering discourse for them? So, I mean, I love some of the suggestions that Dennis made. I've actually been somebody who has signed on to a lot of things as a college president, and I also, of course, always question, does it make any difference? So I think your question about what is the mechanism by which higher education, ethics centers, colleges and universities can actually change public discourse. I mean, maybe we need more people to be, the Stephen Colberts, educate people not only to run for public office, but also to take to the airwaves in ways that will change hearts and minds.
So I want to press on this question of what are the possible mechanisms for, I like this idea of, separating the rot meter that registers problematic elitism from a rot meter that actually permits people to sort between good arguments and bad ones, evidence-based claims and claims that aren't based on evidence. And partly the conversation has been about allies, schools of education, K through 12 teachers, ways in which we can connect with them and support them and perhaps give them the resources for working on this. I also want to introduce the issue of sort of allies of journalism. I mean, so the New York Times here was thought of, came up as an example, but let me just give one example of a quandary. So in 2008, in the Obama election, we were already dealing with the problem of fake news in various ways. You'll remember back to the Obama is a Muslim rumors and that sort of thing. So it's true that this goes well back. It goes back 2 decades, really. It's been building. And at the time, I was lucky to serve on the Pulitzer Prize board, and one of the projects that came up, I think my colleague Joyce, who's here, was probably also on the board at the time. Exactly. One of the projects that came up was PolitiFact. And PolitiFact won the Pulitzer Prize that year. It was a brand new enterprise, fact-checking, right, as a thing that journalism would do separately from the writing of stories and that sort of thing. And speaking only for myself, I can't speak for my colleagues on the board, but speaking only for myself, I certainly voted in favor of that getting a Pulitzer in the hope that a formal mechanism of bringing public attention to the question of fact-checking would help to rebuild these kinds of capacities in public life. Not clear to me that it has had that kind of impact over the following 8 years. So just throwing out that example, I'm curious to know in the first instance what you think about those kinds of fact-checking mechanisms. Do they help? And if they don't, then where do we even see any beginnings of solutions that help to reverse this?
Well, I'm a PolitiFact junkie, so I'm glad that you voted for PolitiFact. Though I do think sometimes they don't. I mean, it's hard. Sometimes I like that they have the pants on fire signifier, but sometimes there's almost a kind of unfortunate sort of equivalence where deception, as opposed to something that isn't quite right, gets the same sort of rating. But I really like what you raised about allies, especially with journalism, because it seems to me that part of what's going on right now is a very concerted attack on journalism, on journalism as part of a democratic society. And so how can higher education and the media become stronger allies than they have been? And I'd be interested.
Well, yeah, and one thing, I said this might be a difficult problem, and that our influence has to be probably indirect. But even within the university, and picking up on your point about journalism, actually, look at the Ivy League universities. Journalism is not a major. It's not, we have a press center in the Kennedy School, but they don't interact with our social psychologists very much, I don't even think the ed school very. So one of the things I was calling for and saying we need to have study of and collaborative work is within the university. A lot of these things are isolated, could be put together to examine why it is that the media has become under attack and to what extent is it justified or not. There is now some research, actually, political scientists are doing on PolitiFact. It turns out it's actually more effective than I would have thought it would be. But it's, it's mixed. And I think part of it is we have a lot of creative people in a lot of schools and community colleges. If presidents were to identify this as a very difficult problem, and I don't, climate change is an example, but veracity is our business. And we ought to be out there protecting it. And we ought to find out ways to do it. And I agree with Drew, maybe Harvard can get in the New York Times more easily than you can, but one reason we get in the New York Times is that people like to say, Harvard does it. It's sort of, when I was in the administration, we never wanted to be in the New York Times. And now we have a more respectable administration, so we can do it. But
there were 3 stories about Harvard in the Globe this morning. They were all horrible. They were all terrible things that had happened.
Not your fault. Not your fault.
So, Drew, when you first responded to Dennis, you said that some of his ideas were practical and some of them were impractical. Can you give us an example of which was which?
Talk about the practical.
I guess maybe the word I should have used would be effective, things that I thought would have an effect. And as this conversation is evolving, there's just something in my mind that I think about a lot in relationship to these ideas, and I'd like to raise it, which is the issue of trust. And you're going to believe things from people or institutions that you trust. And so part of the breakdown in veracity and acknowledgement of authority and expertise, I think, is an undermining of trust in institutions. And so I've been thinking a lot about what have we done that has led to an erosion of trust. I can't fix things that other people have done necessarily, but when I think about how do we become trustworthy and where are the places that trust in universities, the erosion of trust in universities came from. And so I think that when I jokingly said 3 things, when those kinds of things appear in the news, mistakes, one of them was about alleged cheating in a course, dishonest students cheating in a course, front page in the Globe this morning. That makes the public at large say, where's the ethical foundation of this institution? Why, it erodes trust in us. Erosion of trust is not unrelated to social media, to 24/7 news, to the search for something that will be so outrageous that it will attract attention. And that is usually a negative thing. So I think we need to think about all this in the context of the changing nature of the media and the issues of corruption that Larry has talked so much about. There's so many major institutions that have been exposed in one way or another. The Catholic Church and the scandals about sexual assault in the Catholic Church. So I think to get back to having people who have the right and the respect to say this is a truth, that scientists or universities talking about climate change, we've got to address this broader issue that no one is trusted by those who aren't emotionally attached to them already, the heart part. So how do we deal with that?
So let me put another turn on the dilemma or the quandary. And so yes, trust is a problem, but Elizabeth presented us with some evidence that to some extent the distrust has been intentionally manufactured by people who desire to undermine the authority of universities. And so that, for me, a question that I can never come up with the answer to is, Is it if you then sort of set about the business of trying to regain trust, are in an intentional sort of direct way, and for example, say perhaps avoid doing things that might be more controversial in order to regain trust, have you not then simply capitulated to the efforts of the people who sought in the first instance to undermine the authority of universities? Elizabeth?
Wow, okay. Great question. I'm thinking about this. I mean, because you're absolutely right. This trust has eroded. How do we regain it? And I think part of it is, I guess I wouldn't worry so much about playing into the hands of those, maybe I should, but it seems to me that what we really need to do is to reach beyond those who are intentionally seeking to undermine institutions, and to reach those who I still believe, that people want institutions in their lives that are meaningful. I mean, I do think people want that, that there is a hunger for being a part of institutions that make a difference. David Brooks had a wonderful column a few weeks ago about thick institutions, that people feel good about being a part of such an institution. So how do you create that, and then how do you, if people don't think you're that sort of institution, how do you regain it? And I think some of it is about being very clear about our faults, maybe. I mean, it's actually what I was reminded of, which is a funny thing and maybe a random story, but seems apropos in this moment, is how I landed the first big gift for the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and it was when we had it was actually an academic integrity study at Duke, which showed that there were very, very high rates of fabrication of data by students in science courses at Duke University. Very, very high rates, dramatically high rates. And the student, and so I got up on the floor of the faculty meeting and shared this data and talked about, the implications of this for pedagogy and all sorts of things. And then the student paper got a hold of it. And so somebody in the administration called me to say, once the student paper publishes it, this is going to be in the larger media. And so I called Nan Cohan, who was chair of the board of the Kenan Institute, and I talked to her about this, and I was like, well, we've got several options, and I give her huge credit. I mean, I recommend it, but she really went with it. She said, I think we go public with it. We go public with this data. This is really serious, and we need to do something about it. Now, it was front page Wall Street Journal, which was not, I'm sure didn't make a lot of Duke alumni very happy. But interestingly, there were people, including this donor, who told me the reason he gave this big gift to the Kenan Institute for Ethics was because we went public with that data. He thought that it was, and he was not a Duke grad, and he just really appreciated the willingness to be public about our dirty laundry in a way. So
can I give an example of what I really like that story? But as you were asking that question, Ann Coulter is trying to discredit universities. She's trying to provoke behavior that will make universities look awful. Mm-hmm. And so if we could create a situation at Berkeley where Ann Coulter came and spoke and no one cared, that would be a way to combat what you're talking about, I think.
Yes.
So yeah. I see all these free speech provocations as a direct assault of the kind you, Elizabeth, were describing, that we could manage in a way that would refute what those who are attacking us are trying to put forward. So I think that's a place we
I think these are good suggestions about what universities should do, and I think good universities are actually doing them. Occasionally, you can't deal with some of these provocateurs, especially when in a setting like Berkeley. But on Ann Coulter, I mean, I think one of this free speech, inviting prominent conservatives or, my day, prominent leftists, they all seem to have disappeared, to campus was more theater, and that's even if these people get to speak, they're either speaking to the converted or curiosity seekers. And what instead we should try to do, I realize it's not always possible, is to create forums where conservative, liberal, left ideas, we're short in the US campuses of, if you go to Europe, you'll see what really leftism can be. Instead of just having people come and do a show, which is what it amounts to, we should try to get them, and we should engage. We would learn more. More of our students and faculty would come. But instead, we've fallen into this pattern of, we'll have a conservative speaker, we'll have a prominent controversial speaker, and that's free speech. No, I mean, that's free theater, actually.
So I'm going to ask one more question of Dennis before I open it up for the audience, so get your minds thinking about what you want to ask. So Dennis, this last comment is really interesting because you've taken some examples that were about very direct, performative, strong communicative actions and turned it into the need to focus on space for genuine reflection and deliberation. And that seems like a very helpful suggestion. I wonder how that move also connects to the point you made twice now, I think, in these remarks, that we should be using our acting indirectly, which I wonder about a sort of emphasis on indirection in a context where the problem is trust. Doesn't indirection and acting indirectly undermine our ability to rebuild trust?
Well, there's some things we can do directly. I mean, things we have control over, and within the university, yes. So I wouldn't say that's indirect. That's front and center. The indirection I was referring to is trying to reach, call it the heartland. And there, I think that my suggestion was to use our students and civic education and things like that. But here at home, I mean, let me ask you, Danielle. I mean, one of the
typical. I say,
no,
turn it around on me. Thank you.
It's something we get charged with, universities, and they don't trust us because we're too conservative. I mean, we're too liberal. We have a bias against conservatives. And it is true that our faculty, as far as we can tell in the social sciences, leaving aside the economists, which is a complicated case, are more liberal than conservative. And so that's another reason. A large segment of not only the heartland, but the respectable, moderate conservative elite don't trust us. We're all liberals. We're indoctrinating. So how do you counter that?
That's a question for all of us, I think. So let's see, we've got some over. Let's start with Larry. The microphone's coming. I'll do my best. I'm seeing hands.
I think it's really important to keep a kind of materialist point on the table. If you think about the business model of journalism at the time Derek wrote his piece in 1976, a central objective of newspapers was to tell the truth and to have the truth at the center of public debate. There was a wonderful study, I think it's by Shorenstein, but it was a study of the way media is treating all sorts of institutions. And what the study was demonstrating, that the media, that the increasingly fragmented media is increasingly taking institutions as the thing to be attacking, as completely discredited. And so there's a business model here. It obviously pays for them to tear apart every single institution, so that we have this problem that if it is in the interest of the media to be tearing apart every institution, what is the resistance to that? And then the second part of this is, I think we need to be very specific about the kind of motivations for the narratives of distrust. So Joe Scarborough, when he had Scarborough Country, I think that's what it was called, had this, this kind of infamous exchange with Robert Kennedy about vaccines. And, Robert Kennedy was on there telling his story about how vaccines are causing autism, and Scarborough was with him. And Scarborough's rhetoric was, this is all tobacco science. So what he was doing was he was invoking the corruption meme as a way of understanding why the truth about autism had been hidden. It was in the financial interest of the researchers to be telling a story about vaccines that was inconsistent with this underlying truth. And I just think this points, obviously, to something, Dennis, you're quite familiar with, and you helped me get familiar with. This points to one way in which we have to be especially careful to build the structures of veracity such that these simple memes of skepticism can't be so easily woven into the story they tell about us. I mean, it's ridiculous that we would have science that would have such a financially interested motivation behind it. And we have to be, and obviously places like Harvard can afford this kind of integrity more than other places can afford it. But I think all of us need to to push the institutional corruption story here, need to raise this standard very firmly so that we can have a context of science, that there is a good reason to believe and no good reason to doubt.
I totally agree.
Because there are reasons to distrust science, in fact, and which you have made very clear.
Michael.
I wanted to back up Dennis's proposals a little bit more. You seem to be very much on the defensive in this discussion so far. But, you were saying that one of the things that really has to be done, I think everybody agreed, is to promote much more civic education in the high schools, the elementary schools. That's where you can really reach people. Well, I'm very involved in trying to promote civic education in high schools, and I think an affirmative stand from Harvard, from other universities as a collaboration, would be really helpful on this. To some extent, I think this conversation has been very defensive, that with good reason, you've got to worry about the reputation of the university and all, but you're being very sensitive to what certain politicians are going to say, what certain media is going to say. But, for the people who are in the trenches standing up for truth and talking to kids and trying to convey some of these ideas, getting some strong stand with a stamp of Harvard on it can make a big difference. And just to be very specific on it, I've been very concerned about the importance of social studies teachers teaching controversial ideas, teaching kids how they can deal with controversial ideas, tolerate people with opposing views, be fact-based in evidence, approach social media from a factual evidence point of view. It's a difficult pedagogical position to really push. It takes a lot more professional development. It bucks up against a lot of academic freedom ideas. So we need bolstering for the people who are inclined to think about veracity, et cetera, which is teachers and people who come from that kind of background. And if they're not going to get the support in this hostile environment from major universities that should be standing from it, I don't know where they're going to get the support. So I just wanted to throw that on the table.
Thank you.
Anybody want to respond or comment?
Thank you. That's good.
Actually, could I just
Yeah,
very
sure,
quickly?
Elizabeth,
I think the other point. It was a great comment. I think I would also underscore. It seems to me there's the issue about veracity, but then there's also the issue which Dennis has done wonderful work on over the years around civil disagreement. And I think that's a place where we also have a real moral obligation. Higher education has an obligation to do more. And I think K-12 does more, but on campuses we need to be doing more to model that kind of robust civil disagreement.
Let's see, Yuli, let's go. We have to ask the Minister of Education has to.
Well, I wonder if actually Harvard is the right place to start and create trust, because I think the trust is not, or the debate, is not between progressive and conservatives. It's a debate about the elites, and Harvard would always be an elite, and it should be the elite. So I think the question is a wider question of how to create some sort of a new dialogue between the elite and the people who feel that they are sort of isolated from it. And the universities probably are not the best place to start because, you choose people according to merit, and you take pride in it, and that's right. The question is, can people see the value of an elite? And they can see the value of an elite only if this elite will be in some way serving their interests. And they don't see that right now. So I think just going, and bringing people in or speaking about conservatism or reactionary ideas, that's not the thing. The thing is to prove to the society the value of the elite.
I would really reinforce that in this, and I think it's consistent with my bubble concern, that how do we make people outside of our little bubble think that we are contributing something of value? And I think we need to be much more self-conscious about that. But I also think there are things we can do. Harvard X says, here is the learning of Harvard. Enjoy it. Profit from it in your own way. Have it free. And what other things can we do to make it seem that Harvard is not just restricted to a few people who are an elite and may be resented by everyone else? I was at the American Association of Universities meeting last week in Washington, university presidents from the 62 largest research universities. And the staff of the AAU had done a survey, had commissioned a survey of how universities are perceived. The things people think about us that are so mind-boggling and so untrue. There was a whole focus group where every single person in this group thought that we were all for-profit institutions, that we all made money, and that's why tuition was so high. Things like that. We have to communicate better about who we are and what we do if we're going to not be seen as an elite with purposes at odds with the public at large.
Yeah, but Yuli, when you started, it sounded like when you say universities are not the place to start. Well, that's often, and maybe you didn't mean it that way. We don't have to do anything about it. We just keep doing what we're doing, and nobody's going to trust us because we're elitists. And somebody else has to start breaking down the distrust of elites. But I mean, your analysis of the bubble is right, but I agree with Drew. We can't just simply keep doing what we're doing and assuming that somebody else will somehow help rebuild the trust and belief in universities as institutions that care about veracity.
You don't start with vindicating the role of the university, but vindicating the role of the elite. And then educating an elite becomes something that is valuable for many people, not only for the elite itself, but for the rest of the society.
I care about universities more than about elites, though.
Tim, let's bring it to Tim. Oops, microphone's coming.
I want to say a quick word about the word elite and then make a suggestion. Elite, somebody's an elitist is somebody who looks down on you. Elitist is a pejorative term because it involves an attitude of condescension or superiority. But it's being used in the current debate is just part of the general strategy of trying to avoid arguing about substance by criticizing the motives of the people who disagree with you. So an elitist in the present discourse is first and foremost somebody who's saying something that you don't want to hear, or your listeners don't want to hear. So instead of arguing about whether what they say is true or not, you say, well, they're elitists, and anybody, I don't know. Donald Trump isn't an elitist no matter how rich he is, other people, but a middle-class housewives in Omaha who go out on the street with signs about global warming are sure to be called elitist, right? So that's what's going on. So given that Harvard is a place that almost nobody can get into, it's bound to be thought of as a place that looks down on, maybe there's some projection there, looks down on people, feels superior, so it's naturally vulnerable to being subject to this strategy for discrediting. Then this did go to just say one suggestion about Drew's idea about how to get voices that can be heard outside that aren't open to that. Well, I think through our students is a great idea. But there are also our ex-students, that is alumni who are out there in positions of power, and in positions of power that they may be rich, they may be powerful, but they may not all be Democrats, whatever. Now, global warming is something, climate change is something that really ought not to be a partisan issue. The question of what we ought to do about it, what are the right mechanisms, is something there might be a disagreement about. People have different views about economics and so on, but the fact itself really shouldn't be. So presumably there are lots of prominent businessmen out there, maybe graduates of the Harvard Business School, who recognize this, but who don't say it because it's not the thing that's said in their circles. I don't know. I'm just guessing that might be true. So maybe the business school, not have a public event, have a workshop, getting together business leaders to talk about the threat of climate change. And talk about the need for people who can't be discredited as elitists in this way, at least maybe not right off the bat, maybe once they start doing it they might get discredited. Anyway, to try to give credibility to this and make it a less partisan issue, because they won't be as easily discredited because they're people who from some ways look as if they're on their team. If somebody on our team says something, then it's less, that person is less likely to be discreditable by saying, well, we don't trust their motives, and so on. But there's a suggestion for let the business school do it.
There's such a beautiful forest of hands. I'm having trouble spotting if there's a student hand that's gone up, though. So let me just see if there's student hands. Okay, in the back, then.
Yes, thank you. President Faust referred to being in a bubble. Elizabeth spoke of thick institutions. I'm grappling with the role of universities, and certainly the role of Harvard, in events like those happening in Venezuela as we speak, where Venezuelans, and by the way, I'm not Venezuelan, are being killed by a military dictatorship. There's a women's march planned for tomorrow by Lilian Tintori, whose husband is imprisoned, and the government is not disclosing his whereabouts. Is this not an ethical issue, and one where the university has a responsibility if it is going to be an engaged university? I'm trying to understand this issue from a broader global domain.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you raised the sort of the larger, I mean, not that veracity is not a big question, I don't mean to suggest that, but I do think that there's a sort of larger universe of questions around where and how and should the universities take stands in the face of forces that undermine core values of a university. And it's actually, I think it's one of the things I have struggled with the most in the last months is, where do we draw the line? I mean, in situations where there is at least one narrative looking across the world that democracy itself is being, profoundly undermined and under attack. And you look at what's happening in Hungary with the attack on Central Europe University. There are fascistic elements to a lot of what is happening. So what is the responsibility of higher education leaders in the face of those developments? I'm the daughter of political prisoners in Hungary under both the Nazis and the communists, and I think it's a moment when we have to pay attention to what is happening, and will higher education be a bulwark for values of democracy and inclusion?
Let me push you a little bit, Elizabeth.
Sure.
So you asked me,
Yes.
what should the responsibility be? So what's your answer?
Yeah, so to Venezuela, what is my answer? And that's the hard thing. It's like, it's actually one of the things that, and I'm sure others can relate to this too, is that if you make a statement about absolutely everything, statements can become sort of empty rhetoric, right? So it's actually one of the things I've struggled with students, where there is a kind of demand for, at least, I'm sure you're getting it from all sides, Drew, but at Agnes Scott, I've been getting lots of demands that the college take a stand, issue statements, and I have issued some statements, as have many college presidents, but the litmus test of under what circumstances does it make sense, either because of what it states to a larger public. I've written about undocumented students. I've written about things where I felt like where we were situated in Georgia, this was incredibly important for us to try to make a statement that could at least try to shape political rhetoric. So with Venezuela, I don't know what higher education's role is. I mean, I don't know. And I think that's one of the difficulties. If we speak up on everything, but perhaps we need to speak up on the trends and to talk about this is actually what I meant when I was talking about attacks on journalism, because I feel like we do need to stand up and make principled statements about the kinds of democratic institutions which support free inquiry and the basis of learning, and what we stand for as institutions. So not a very good answer, but
Vanilla, in the very back.
Thanks a lot. Oh, that's right. Thanks a lot. My question is sort of somewhat related to Professor Scanlon's, or at least running off of that theme, is I wonder what role diversity in the university has to play in this conversation. Specifically, it's a lot easier to make, it's a lot more plausible to make the claim that certain people have certain motives that you should doubt if they are in some ways not heterogeneous, if you look at certain respects, right? Whatever the relevant metric is. So do you think thinking about heterogeneity in the people we admit and balancing that with the reasonable desire towards having academic excellence might bear on the plausibility of us actually saying, look, these are actually facts, and it's not the fact that everybody happens to come from a certain income class that makes it more likely that they're likely to have these views, whereas everyone else happens to have a different set of beliefs.
Drew?
That's a great comment. I think it reminds us that assumptions can be misleading if they're made without a broad sense of the different perspectives that might inform those assumptions. It also, I think, underscores the fact that when we're asked constantly to make statements, who is we? Mm-hmm. And in much of this conversation, I've been thinking to myself, is this a request for statements from the president's office, of which we've been asked to make many, many in recent months? Or exactly what does it mean to have a university do something? Does it mean we fund a center that addresses the problems of the future of democracy? Or does it mean that Elizabeth issues a statement as president of Agnes Scott? So part of what's at stake here, I think, is exactly what does it mean to have an institution endorse a position, and who makes up that institution? And how do we also, as an institution, make sure that we encourage the heterogeneity of the voices that you indicated should be so central to who we understand ourselves to be?
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I also really appreciate that the statement about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and I think that and I think actually higher ed has been trying to really speak up and to wrestle with questions around diversity and inclusion. I think there's been we have a lot of work to do, but there's been a lot of progress made over the last several decades, and there's a lot of really good evidence for why diverse groups make better, smarter decisions. In terms of how that relates to people's distrust of universities, I mean, I do think, and this is actually something when Larry talked about the material conditions, I thought you were going to go to this, that I actually think one of the big reasons why people distrust universities is college cost. I think, in the mid-'80s, the average middle-class family worked for, I think the stat is 3 months to cover the sticker price for a year of higher education, and now it's like a year. And so the pressure on middle-class families and that sense that higher education is out of their reach is very real. And I think it's part of what's fueling the rage and the distrust.
The sense that we're all making money.
And the sense that we're all making money. And, and that's not to say that Harvard doesn't give, some very generous financial aid to students. We are 40% Pell Grant recipients at Agnes Scott. We're very socioeconomically diverse, but we get that too. People in Georgia who say, oh, you elitist institution use. So it's a hard one to, because some of it is actually misinformation, it's not veracity, and some of it is the fact that it is just really expensive to.
So we're almost out of time, so we're going to take Jeff and Tony in the middle of the room as our last two questions. So if you could both ask your question, and then we'll invite wrap up.
I've heard a lot about carrots, but shouldn't you also have sticks to wield in this debate when you're dealing with climate change deniers or Holocaust deniers or biology teachers who don't believe in evolution by natural selection? They're graduates of universities and colleges somewhere. They're cited as quote-unquote scientists by the deniers of climate change. Shouldn't colleges and universities come out publicly and state that this alumnus is a disgrace to our college? That this alumnus...
Where would we stop?
Shouldn't, and I'm not saying that anyone from Agnes Scott or Harvard falls into this category, but at some point I think that that there should be some penalty to scientists who engage in patently false or patently bad science for their alma mater to say, we repudiate this work. You are an embarrassment to our college.
You just pass the microphone up the row in front of you. Oh, in front of you. Thanks. Yeah. No worries.
Two things. One, I think it's important to talk about the actual role of education in the 21st century and the ways in which the education system, and in particular higher ed, is designed to prepare generations, a generation of people for the economy of tomorrow, and the ways that those individuals derive meaning from the learning experiences that they believe will prepare them for the future. And so I share that because I'm thinking about the practical applications of how to, disseminate or mobilize students in ways that separate this issue of elites and non-elites, if we can call them that, and thinking about, in the world of education, this idea of the non-traditional student, and realizing that increasingly students are becoming non-traditional students as a result of their, intersectional identities. And so I think that's an important thing to note because I want to share an example of a very practical application of the ways that you can engage students in this civic education or the civic project. So I graduated from the ed school and was very interested in finding ways to connect many of the young people from the community that I worked in who had never considered going to college, never mind Harvard, to engage and think about what Harvard meant to them symbolically, not in terms of attending the school itself. And so simply invited them. And so thinking about this idea of what the bubble means and saying, just come for a walk with me on campus. And being able to leverage the Harvard name in a way where we could get the school board to say, oh, you want to bring the kids to Harvard? Oh, absolutely, we're on board, we're behind that. And then once on campus, to introduce the students to people who could actually ask and answer their questions. Ask them questions and answer their have the students ask their questions and have their questions answered by real students. And so I just want to, I think, encourage folks to think about this not as something that's overly complicated. It could be as simple as thinking about what your student body is doing, what students are doing on the ground and the ways that they are trying to stay connected to their communities. The result of this project of inviting the students to campus was that then 3 of those students decided to organize their own conference locally. And they decided to organize the conference with the support of their teachers. That event got media coverage. Another school decided to do the same thing, and it's had a ripple effect ever since. And so I would also say that this idea that students or the public are empty vessels that are waiting to be filled is not. I think doesn't speak to the kind of brilliance that already exists outside of these spaces. And the idea is to be able to leverage our position and their experience in ways that I think will transform the larger discourse and narrative around, contemporary issues today.
Great, thank you. Would anybody like to follow up on that?
Well, I want to follow up on the both. Actually, I'll try briefly on both. On the repudiating alumni suggestion. I'm a Davidson grad, and Davidson has actually really wrestled with this because one of our alums turned out to be one of the manufacturers of fake news. He's a young man. He's about 25 years old, and the story. He was the one who manufactured the story about the Hillary Clinton ballot boxes, and made quite a bit of money off of this. And this is Davidson, which is an honor code school going way back, a thick institution that was really, and so there was a huge effort by alums to have his degree stripped because people were so upset that somebody with a Davidson degree would have done this. And he did lose his job in Congress. But interestingly, what Davidson is actually doing, which I think is really interesting, is, and I'm going to be participating in this, is organizing a dialogue where he is going to be part of the dialogue around the ethics of veracity, actually. It'll be a veracity project. And so there were a lot of people who felt that he should have his degree stripped. I would not have made that decision myself, but I think that but there was a real need to respond, I think, and so I like what they're doing. And I love that example of ways of demystifying the aura and breaking through the bubble. I think it's just so important for us to find those ways, and also to highlight, because there are lots of first-generation college students right here at Harvard, as there are at Agnes Scott, and sometimes I think we don't do enough to, I just took 19 first-year students on a trip to Central Europe. One of them had never been outside of Georgia, had never been on a plane, had never been on a boat, I discovered when she got seasick on the Danube. And there are students at selective colleges, at elite colleges with that story, and I think that's another piece of what we need to work on, breaking down the bubble in the narratives that we share about who we are.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.
For setting this up. It was great. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I want to remind everyone that you are cordially invited to a party at the Fogg Art Museum, which begins at 6 p.m. If you've not been on campus recently, then you should come just because it's beautiful and you'll enjoy the museum. It's also, of course, a chance for friends to see each other and spend time together. Before we close, I also just want to do a final thanks to a few people, all of our speakers today. Derek and Cicely Bach, again, thank you so much for being with us. Angelica and Neil Rudenstein, thank you very much. Carol Thompson, we didn't thank you for being here and all you've done throughout, but thank you very much. Stephanie Dant is here today as well. It's terrific to have her back. In the back there. Jean McVeigh was instrumental in the early years of the center. The Faculty Advisory Committee, many of whom are here. Can all of you Faculty Advisory Committee members who are here please stand up? They deserve a round of applause for you. They're the true secret sauce of everything that happens at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. And the team in the center who put this event together today. So if I could ask the following people to stand, I'm not sure where you are in the room. Susan Cox, Monica Tesoriero, Jess Miner, Maggie Gates, Kyle Hecht, Tomer Perry, and Emily Bromley. Thank you. You all know how impossible it is to do things without people like this who are carrying all the weight and putting all the wind in everybody's sails. So thank you very much. Have fun this evening. Looking forward to seeing you at the museum at 6.